Another ale, and Osrith's head was beginning to feel warm. The air around her moved slowly, and she pushed past a couple of warriors as she went to hover near a table which had mentioned Mercia, and she strained to listen. But the conversation was interrupted when the door was pushed open. "They will have an ale," her brother said, "and so will she." Beside Utad was a woman, long, tangled white blonde hair, whose eyes seemed to be on everything. He pushed his way across to a table he wanted and moved the occupants away. Like Osrith, Utad clearly wanted to drink his sorrows away, and Osrith crossed closer to her brother. Unlike him, she had only been there to witness the death of a woman in childbirth. For him, Gisela was his whole world. Osrith saw Sihrik, and wondered whether he knew his wife was busy working up above the bar. Was her brother really condoning one of his men to let his wife work on her back? But, she supposed, he had more important things on his mind tonight, and he slurred his words as he drank more ale, picked an argument with a man who happened to be doing nothing more than sitting next to them. She could sit there no longer, and Osrith pushed her way out of the inn, knowing if she did not stop now, that she never would, and she had to turn up and practice sword skill with the Etheling in the morning. If she had not paused to look back to Utad, Osrith would never know that she was being followed out of the inn. As it was, she caught sight of a face she really rather would not see. The arm belonging to the face, nose still swollen from her smashing her head into it a few daps before, pushed her towards the wooden wall outside the inn. "I knew I would find you out, I said I would, didn't I?" he oiled, as his broken face came close to her ear. "I know where you were today, warrior girl, I know what you did." But, the question is, does he know? With one hand, Athelwold jabbed a finger towards Utad. "Do you want me to tell him?" "I did nothing." Osrith spat back, but her heart was telling her she was not as wholly innocent as she would like to convince herself. She had made Allah give her the tansy root, and she may not have had enough to give to Gisela, yet the woman had said it was an impossible birth. But, Ethelwold was squaring up to Osrith, and swung his fist to hit her. Osrith ducked. It was not enough though, to avoid Ethelwold catching her by the throat. Her head banged onto the wood. It hurt, despite the alcohol, and now Ethelwold had her head by her hair, which hurt more than Osrith expected it to. "If only you had given yourself to me," Ethelwold sighed, sarcastically. "You could be Queen of Wessex." "There are no queens in Wessex," Osrith retorted. "When I am king, I can make it so." He brought Osrith's face close to his. "Would you like to be my queen?" But, Ethelwold could say no more, as a wish of steel parted blade from scabbard, and Finan stepped between them. "Yours then, Irishman," Ethelwold blustered, stepping from Osrith when Finan turned his back on her and began to bear down on Ethelwold, stepping slowly, deliberately towards him, his sword out halfway, and held the tip towards the man. Then, Finan turned to Osrith. "My thanks," Osrith managed to say, the strong ale still addling her head despite the cool night. "The thanks is mine," Finan said. "I know what you did. I saw Jan in Beamflout, with the Danes, with Eric Thurgilson, under normal circumstances, where she hadn't deliberately set out to get drunk. She might have wondered how Finan knew the Norse brother's name." "I am no traitor," Osrith protested. "I never said you were," Finan replied, chuckling softly as he stood silently before Osrith's imprecise outrage. The door to the inn creaked open, and in the doorway, a very inebriated Utad staggered. "You," he declared, pointing to Osrith, "you will not defy me again." "You are no lord of mine," Osrith declared, glaring at Utad as he stormed over to her. Her brain was trying to catch on to an idea, but it was drowned out by shouting. "Any lord of Alfred is a lord of yours," he reminded her. And Buet was out. Osrith did not even remember unsheathing her blade, and ran at Utad, aiming for his shoulder. But Finan was quicker than her, and knocked her sword away with his own. "Ursel!" Osrith spat at her brother, and Ursel more. Beside her, Finan broke into uproarious laughter as a crowd of people began to gather round them, Utad's men, of course. Osrith scorned, and others keen to see who was causing a commotion. Finan, meanwhile, had pushed Osrith away, and was standing between her and Utad. He looked across to Sihrik and Osferth, who both flanked Ughtred. He was drunk, anyone could see that, except Osrith, who was also drunk, and Finan laughed again as if all of the hostility was part of one big joke. What dreadful language from such a lovely mouth, he humoured, but Osrith's mind did not pick up on the hint, and instead, she turned Bué on Finan. The Irishman held up his arms, as Bué's sword point touched his neck. Bad manners. He scolded her, as his knee hit Osrith's wrist, and dislodged Bué from her hand. She bent to find it, as Finan urged Ughtred's men to get him away, as he was about to join, struggling under the grip of Sirik and Osferth at his shoulders. Finan's momentary lapse of concentration was enough. It was all she needed to slam his arm back, which was held out in front of her, and sinking her teeth into his wrist. Very bad manners. He shouted at Osrith, and pushed her against the inn wall, as Ethelwold had done, not long before. But, unlike Ethelwold, Osrith had no desire to fight him off as he held her shoulders. "And get her out of here," Finan shouted, as the tall, blonde woman who had been with Ughtred's company hovered behind his men. She was staring between Osrith and Ughtred, but said nothing, and in Osrith's mixed-up thoughts, she wondered how it was that her brother had already taken a lover when his wife had died just that afternoon, and had been buried that evening. Osrith slipped from under Finan's hold as he directed the men to take Ughtred home, but he realized she was moving, and pushed her away again. "No you don't, Caeleg," he warned her. "Warrior," Osrith corrected him, and the night air was enough to have allowed her to regain some coherence of thought, for she had pulled Bué towards her with her foot, and with one swift movement, bent, and was threatening Finan with it again. "You lost there, Finan my friend." A laugh came from his lord, and Ughtred continued to laugh as Finan shook his arm, where Osrith had scored Bué along it. "Like hell I did," he retorted. But Osrith was faster and she darted out from under Finan's arm. "Leave her," Ughtred called after him, as Finan ran after Osrith. "Leave me," Osrith declared, as the man she had so often lusted after caught up with her. She pulled up sharply, the heavy soil under her boots, leveling Bué. Then she realized her way was blocked. She had run into a dead end. A dozen different ways to escape ran through Osrith's mind as Finan approached, holding Soul Stealer. "I am not going to hurt you," Finan declared. But Osrith believed that as much as she would believe her uncle Elfric rescued orphaned kittens. She held her sword tighter. "I'm just helping you along," Finan continued. "You see, the Lord Ughtred has suffered a grievous loss this day, and it would not help either of you if you got into bother with one another, would it?" Osrith leveled Bué again. "I'm not going to hurt you," Finan reiterated. "I have heard that line before," Osrith scoffed. "I have learned to trust my blade, not the word of a man." Behind him, people had crowded. "You fight well." This was the voice of her brother now, and Osrith glanced past Finan's shoulder. He didn't seem angry now, sort of resigned. Yet, it was she who was standing with her back to the palace's inner wall, contemplating the best 3 ways to scale it. "Right," she replied, curtly. "Before you called me a weasel cock." "I called you a great donkey," Osrith corrected him. "Which you know I'm not," Ughtred continued. She could see he was mocking her, and she narrowed her eyes. She was not in the mood. "I couldn't possibly say," Osrith scorned, and couldn't help herself when she added, "though rumor has it that, you know, Acorn." It satisfied her childish side when Ughtred made a start towards her as she waggled her little finger at him. Osferth and Sirik gripped his arms and held him fast, as Finan stood between them. "And the honor that you speak of," Osrith continued, as she chided her brother. "Stand by and watch as a woman gets raped." "Women get raped every day," Ughtred shot back. Osrith felt herself standing tall, Bué in both hands. Had Finan not been a physical presence between the two of them, Osrith would have flown at him. Then they should be taught to fight, from birth, to support themselves, not rely on a man. She scorned. "Lord!" Finan shouted, trying to diffuse the tension. But it was no use. Ughtred was spoiling for a fight, any fight, whether with his sword or with words. "But you rely on men, the Wessex Guard, the mercenaries." But it was not Ughtred who spoke, it was Finan. Osrith felt her anger swell in her throat, as the Irishman added, Prince Edward. Pity you don't want your Lord Utad to come any closer, Osrith threatened, clutching Buey, feeling the strength of the gales behind it. Domhnall would want her to pull it in this Gaelish turncoat, for I can easily make him an Orlark. Lord, I will see this warrior away, Finan declared, as he brushed off Utad's ignorance at her words. Despite her tough talk, Osrith let Finan guide her past Utad, but the moment she was out onto the main thoroughfare of the city, she bolted towards the eastern road. Damn it, Osrith thought, for she realized after a few minutes Finan was chasing after her. And there was me thinking Ethelwald has changed his tastes. Finan's words were light, as if he were shaking off Ethelwald's attack of her in an inexplainable way. For a bean, you fight well, but Osrith, now sobering up, turned on her heel. I don't need your company. But that wasn't true. She did want his company, and she stopped, shaking, after a few moments when she realized Finan was still there, looking at her. You have a home, do you not? At Crapelgate. At Eastgate, Osrith admitted, but I am returning to the palace. Ethelwald is at the palace, Finan pointed out. He is always at the palace, Osrith replied, then conceded. If you are determined to follow me all the way home, I would not find that disagreeable. Then what? Finan asked, and stepped closer to her. Osrith stared back at him, eyes narrowing. Never mind, she spat back, in Gaelish, I'll manage just fine. When Finan stepped towards her again, she added, her hand dipping to tagged Sikhs, does your man not need you? He who lost his wife today? She jerked her head past Finan and he stopped too. Utad, with Sihtric trying to urge him away and Osferth pulled at his arm, had followed them. But the alleged Lord of Bibbenberg was having none of it, and he fought his warriors from him. Osrith shook her head. Unbelievable. I would not find it disagreeable. Utad mocked, then strode right up to Osrith. You, in the palace? He scorned. You are no better than the whores in the inn back there. Osrith saw Sihtric wince at his words, but held her face strong. Forget it. Andraster, Finan Anirian, she added. But, when she turned, Utad stood in her way. And we can guess but one purpose of a woman ingratiating herself with a group of men. Call yourself a warrior? He mocked. Yes. Osrith spat back, as her brother made to block her, before pulling her close to him, trying to kiss her. He was drunk and pained from Gisela, so he was taking his anger out on her. So caught up in trying to humiliate her, Utad did not anticipate the thump to his alleged acorn when her knee collided forcefully with his groin. Utad staggered back, in pain as Osrith took up Buey, swinging it back into her shoulder. If I don't find where you sleep and kill you, it will be because I have decided not to waste my time. Osrith turned back. And I did not bring back a whore when my wife was dying giving birth to your child. It took a moment for the words to settle, and settle they did, like persistent snow, all around them. She really shouldn't have said that. Osrith knew there was only one way to go after that, and that was to stand by herself. But, perhaps, Utad hadn't heard her properly, or grasped the full meaning. He did understand she had insulted her, and bore down on her. Osrith, in turn, leveled Buey. Say it again, he warned, and I don't care if you are a woman, I will fight you. And I will win, Utad of Bibbenberg, she retorted, and added in her mind, for my anger has turned to guilt and that runs deeper than your pride and sorrow. Fight me, he challenged. The amber jewel in the hilt of his sword glimmered in the half-light. Like you tried to fight me at Beamflout? I didn't know you were a warrior. But you knew I was a woman, Osrith accused. I have known men of honor, Utad of Bibbenberg, she added, Finol I in her mind now, tagged, Domhnall, Little Neil, Eric Thurgilson, all had kept their word to her. You may think you are one, but you are not. Better that than a Gaelish bitch. Cuerton, Namo, ha Thursday Muke, ha Thursday Clagday Red. She shot back. Ooh. Finan called, that was terrible language, Lord Utad. Finan was now back to deliberately making light of the situation. But neither Osrith nor Utad were keen go with him. And what was it? It wasn't very nice, Finan replied, suddenly vague. But Utad had already raised his sword, and then saw Osrith had ranged a square before them. It was almost right, too. Utad's mind thought. She knew about that. Isn't that how it is done? Osrith challenged him. Isn't that how you fought Kjartan's men, in King Guthred's court? The king of Hallowathicland, my husband, she added silently. How do you know that? Utad's voice betrayed his shock at her knowledge of something so specific, so far away in place and time. You would be surprised what I know. But already, Utad was kicking the wood away, and Osrith couldn't help herself. Utad of Bibbenberg would not fight me, she asked, scornfully. You are a woman, and I do not fight women. I am a Gaelish warrior, Osrith retorted. You have no lord. My lord is silver, or gold, or both. You know about wealth, do you not? If Osrith had been playing with fire before, this was diabolic. She knew that he guessed where his silver had gone to now, and also, she realized that she didn't care. He couldn't prove it, in any case. She was angry, guilt-ridden, hollow. What she needed now was to fight. And he was too slow. Grief, alcohol had slowed his reflexes, which was to say, Utad's abilities were still excellent, but his edge was blunted. Buet made a slash to his arm, and he backed away. Apologies, my lord, Osrith said, in mock deference. Gabmol is dual. But the sarcasm was lost on Utad, for he stood still, and then turned from her, his face a mask of agonized torment. Now that was bad manners. Finan chided her, and to Sifik and Osferth said, get him away home. Her too, he added, nodding towards Skade. Now, you can just tell me what that was all about, Finan said, when Utad had gone, not very quietly, or gracefully, along the high street of Winchester. Hadn't you better go with him? Osrith asked, not yet in the mood to be conciliatory. You bettered Utad, he is the best warrior in the land. Alfred's man. Finan pointed out. I am afraid that is just not so, if you say that I bettered him. But the force had gone from her body, like the final, empty swirls of air after a windstorm. Why here? Finan asked. We come all this way, to Wessex, from Alba. Money. And now I have money, I intend to go home. She lowered her head. And I have got in Ethelwold's way. Not a good move, Finan replied, but then persisted. You look at him a lot, Utad, I mean, from the time you first came here. What is he to you? A legend, Osrith said. Your face says more to it than that, Finan remarked. And it was you who took his silver? He took it from me first, Osrith lied, and they both knew it was a lie. But Osrith had had enough, and began to walk eastwards. Finan began to walk, too. Go with your lord, she dismissed, resheathing Buet. Report to him I took his silver. Have me hanged, or burned, or branded, or whatever the punishment in Wessex is for theft. She shrugged her shoulders and made in the direction of Eastgate. But Finan wasn't about to give up that easily, and continued to walk next to her. You heard what I said? She asked. I took his silver. But Finan acted as if he hadn't heard. Instead, he lowered his head towards her. I miss my home, too, sometimes. Irene. Oh yes? Osrith asked, not resisting his walking next to her. It must have been obvious to everyone who met Finan that he was from Iron's Isle, where my coy einached. She looked at his dark hair and pale eyes. You a tilde negation n a tilde diarus Cecil. Not on your life, he protested. Osrith turned to him. You aren't a null-age shit, are you? And Finan broke into a grin. You have me, he said, placed hand on her shoulder. Osrith gave him a warning look, and shook him free, picking up the pace. He had the manner of speech of an Irishman, at any rate, charm of word, but she wasn't going to concede anything to him that might betray whence she had come, or who she might be. You know Ireland? Finan persisted, as they got to the marketplace. Even at this late hour, a few stalls were standing, idling for custom. Do you know Doyle? Osrith shivered, as a flash of Nine Fingers and his brother assaulting her, leaving her to drown tied to a rock in the northern sea, of Constantine, of Domhnall. I know Doyle was a servant the once, Osrith replied, making her voice sound as light as Finan his earlier that evening. And you wish to return to those bastards? Finan's question exposed many strata of expression, one of which was, clearly hatred, another, loathing. He must have known Flansinner, then, or Kingd, or possibly, Malmuir. The desire to ask further was restrained by Osrith's self-preservation. To ask this man of the royal Uineals was to make it clear who she might be, if her identity was known. And even if was not, it would not take a lot of investigation to find her out. I wish a simpler life, where things were what I thought them to be. Don't we all? Finan replied, and stopped when Osrith pointed to the door that led into her brick-built room. Here, she indicated with her hand, and she waited for Finan to leave. Oidgmuth, she prompted. When he hadn't moved. Andraster, he replied, and only when Osrith had closed the door behind her did she hear feet on the dry earth outside, suggesting Finan of the Ullade had begun to leave. Then, Osrith flung herself onto her bed. How had it come to that? She had thrown her lot in Alba, to be with Utad. All she had imagined, her being greeted by him, being in his company, pledging loyalty to him, all those childish things. And then Gisela. It was true, there was nothing she could have done to save the woman, no power on earth could have, with how far wrong the birth of her child had gone. Osrith crunched up her eyes, the pressure behind her eyelids counteracting the pressure in her mind, and cried, 88,888,888. A week had gone by, and following the worst hangover Osrith had ever experienced, she resolved to do the duty she had been given by King Alfred. Mornings, up and fighting practice with Edward, and when he had been called to be with his father, before Eckard's duty, she had gone to the chapel. Kneeling, closed-eyed, praying, or at least thinking about her sister-in-law as people got up, knelt, or sat, praying too, made her feel a little steadier. But Osrith was none happier. She had heard that Utad had recovered Gisela's body and committed it to a funeral pyre the day afterwards. But he was insisting on carrying on with his duties. That morning, Picard had sat beside her. Osrith had only noticed him when he had coughed, politely, near her ear, and she brought her face round to his. Then, wished she hadn't. I heard you fought with your brother, he began, with his usual directness. I have no brother, Osrith said, and saw the pain flash over Picard's face. Do not say that, he told her, pitifully. But Osrith was not in the mood for coercion. I choose to say it, because I will not be forced into it, nor forced to stay in Winchester, if this is your plan. Picard looked at her, and refused to break his gaze. It was not my doing that the king took you from the Mercen Guard, though will not deny I am pleased you are close to us, he replied. And his look became one of astonishment, as Osrith stood up and left him behind, in the seats neat the back of the chapel, without a word, to guard the Etheling. That night, Osrith remembered sleeping by the door as Edward, brooding about his forthcoming wedding, went to sleep in his own bed. Osrith had resisted the Etheling up till then, and she was far in her own misery to be wanting to orgasm. Not even Finan's face in her mind, which usually did for her after her fingers encouraged her clitoris into action, had stirred up any desire for her to wank herself. However, it was not the floor Osrith found herself on the next morning. Strong arms were enveloping her, and she thought muzzily about the circumstances in which she found herself, with only her shirt and Derek's hair jewel on. It had begun with Edward trying to compel her to talk about her sadness and telling her she was not herself, and had continued with limbs and mouths and a hard-on and sucking and hot, wet fucking. Now, morning, and Osrith knew she would need her lily root, just to make sure, and this was back in her room. Once she got it, she could return to the kitchen and steep it in hot water, before getting on with the day, and she wriggled into her clothing before closing the door behind her. Slipping under the kitchen window, then around to the stables, Osrith's foot pressed on the wall as she leapt into Foregate Street, the quickest route to her lodging near the marketplace. Was she being followed? Ethelwald has found her the last time she was at the palace. Had he found her now, determined to do the same? Osrith trod the stable yard with only the briefest of glances towards where the horses were sleeping. Soon, it had to be soon, and she would go to Hampton and find Ulf and Gert, show them more wealth than they had ever seen in their lifetimes, and return to Alba. The first time, he had pinned her against the wall of the postern doorway, pushing a hand past her hips while holding her hands above her head. a satisfied laugh passing his lips as his fingers became covered in Osrith's and cousin's cum. He had begun to kiss her. That had been his mistake, for Osrith kneed him in the crotch. The second time, he had pursued her across the stableyard, but had not caught up with her. She had learned to time her egress from Edward's room after that, and from then on had evaded him. And yet, Ethelwold. Last time Osrith had seen him, he had not challenged her. He was different. His manner had been cryptic, mystifying. He had looked at her strangely rather than accuse her of Gisla's death. Apart from a few insults, he had said little to her. He had not even been to the training to idle his time away shouting vacuous comments to the warriors. So, on that particular morning, Osrith seemed not to be terrorized by Ethelwold. However, she was impeded by someone. As she leapt the palace wall, her trajectory was terrible as strong hands groped her waists. One had a rather ugly bite mark on it. Osrith looked up into the triumphant face of Uted's man, the Irishman, Finan. Osrith struggled, but he pressed her body with his to the palisade wall. "I think we have a score to settle." Osrith pushed him aside, angry that her thoughts, and her way, had been interrupted. "I am on my way home, I do not seek trouble." But Finan was not letting go of her arm. "Well, you are making trouble. Looking after the Etheling like that." Osrith felt her body stiffen. But she stared Finan down. He nodded in the direction of the window from which Osrith knew Edward would be watching her leave. "Like what?" "Like that, overnight." "He is no boy now." Osrith said nothing as she turned to go, but then turned back. "I swore an oath, apparently, to Wessex. And the Etheling commanded that I guard him last night." She saw Finan roll his eyes. "Guard him? Is that what you weons are calling it these days? Like it's any of your business." "You know he is married," he said, accusingly. "To be married." "Yes," Osrith corrected him, "to the official line, anyway." Rumor had it that Uted, so therefore Finan too, had witnessed the marriage of Edward to Ecgwin, and paid for the priest who carried out the ceremony to live protected, secretly. "As are you," you said so to Uted, once, when I sat upon my brother's house. "And I, come to think of it," Osrith thought, but pushed Guthred's face from her mind so that her memory of Tagd could fill its place, and became more determined than ever to reach Alba now, and leave this wretched Wessex behind. Tagd. Their year and the day were long gone. And the fact that they weren't together for a lot of that yet implied what they always knew, hand-fasted under the summer sun, will not make it to a year and one. But, perhaps, the Morrigan could have been appeased. Then again, it may have been her will to place him where his deep sense of honor meant he had no choice but to attempt to rescue those people in the burning church. And Guthred, well, it had been Constantine's idea, ultimately. Osrith knew that now the church records had it as such. And perversely, this now made her both sister-in-law sister to Uted, for Guthred was Gisla's brother. Osrith imagined for a moment the look on Uted's face if only he knew. Osrith's mind came back to the present. Finan's hands were still around her wrists and he was holding her tightly. She would give to fight. He was agile, as much as Osrith was. She did not want to fight him. She wanted to kiss him. And then Finan let go his grip, stepping back from her and glanced to the flagstones, his head hanging a little. What had happened? "I am, so," Finan replied, and Osrith, to her horror, realized she must have said that aloud to him. "Married. Or I was. The Lord in his infinite wisdom chose to part me from my good wife last winter," he explained, and a sadness took over his features. Osrith stepped past him. For she knew if she did stay, something she would regret would happen, and there were plenty of candidates for the troll. But then she stopped, and reached out a hand. "You are Uted's man." Osrith restrained herself from saying, "hound," for he was not a blind instruction follower like some warriors bonded to lords. "Why am I even talking to you?" she added, more to herself than anything. Finan turned his head. "Because you like my sense of humor," he said, giving her a slight hint of a smile. "I do like your sense of humor," Osrith conceded, then strode away, without looking back. North, Then, Osrith thought to Constantine and King Domnall and the wide Moray Firth and the green lands of Alba and Pitland, and Dunedin where all northern tongues mixed freely, to where she had welcome. And she now had silver to live a life away from Uhtred Ragnarsson, to buy her a place beside the people she cared for most in the world. Her brother's silver, or at least, that stolen in battle. And, if she had to be married to someone, it was infinitely better to be married to a distant Danish king in a land that was her birthright though her mother. Besides, when Domnall saw the wealth she had brought to him, she may well be free of the so-called marriage to the so-called king of Hallowe'erfachland. It might be enough for her to be a warrior in perpetuity. She was not a maid. Constantine had seen to that when she was 12. So wealth it had to be. That Uhtred had aligned himself with the Danes, not the Saxons. Apart from his desire to claim Bibbenberg, he rejected his family. Osrith massaged her hand which had been hit square on with the arrow. She was sure she had seen the man who had fired it give a triumphant look as she continued to row to Lindisfarne, all those years ago, remembered the gleam of delight in his eyes. Osrith had decided then, as the Holy Island was in sight, that she was going to find Uhtred and, well, here she was. And here she had taken so much trouble to find her brother. And now, Osrith thought, she was taking a deal of trouble to leave Uhtred behind her again. "I'll see you around then." Osrith turned, and saw that Finan was still watching her. And Osrith turned, and nodded. "See you around," she called, and meant it. For it would not be long before Osrith would not see Finan around, and when she did not, she knew she would feel nothing but regret.